Could they do that?
It is not an exaggeration to say that the conflation of nuclear proliferation with catastrophic terrorism has brought the world to a nuclear tipping point. If Iran and North Korea cannot be stopped from building nuclear arsenals, I believe that we will cross that tipping point, with consequences that will be much more disastrous than any of us can really imagine today. In the face of these ominous developments, George Shultz decided to hold a workshop at Stanford in 2006 on the 20th anniversary of the Reykjavik summit meeting. At that summit meeting, President Reagan and President Gorbachev had seriously explored the idea of moving toward the elimination of nuclear weapons.
We're not just discussing limits on a further increase of nuclear weapons. We seek instead to reduce their number. We seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth.
President Reagan and Soviet President Gorbachev came close to agreement on that vision in 1986 when the two met in Reykjavik, Iceland. But disagreements over missile defense proved a stumbling block.
I believe that Reykjavik was the real pinnacle of international politics. That is to say, from the high ground, we saw the prospects of a future world, and we both believed that a world of the future could prosper only if it's a world without nuclear weapons.
So the two presidents came right up to the precipice, but in the end, backed away. Most security specialists were incredulous that the two presidents would even discuss such a rash idea. And indeed, I must tell you, I was one of those skeptics. But 20 years later, at the Stanford workshop, we concluded that we ought to revive the idea that Reagan and Gorbachev had discussed at that summit, moving towards a world without nuclear weapons. We believed that some really dramatic action was needed to stop this terrible drift towards a nuclear catastrophe. And the four of us, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and myself, joined forces to write two op-eds in January of 2007 and January of 2008, prescribing such dramatic actions. We were swamped with news articles and letters from colleagues, mostly of the view that the world was long overdue for total reevaluation of our nuclear forces and our nuclear posture. Buoyed by this response, we scheduled meetings with senior government officials and former officials in countries all over the world: Russia, China, India, Japan, United Kingdom. In response to our op-eds and visits, other former officials from around the world began speaking out for a world without nuclear weapons. Indeed, now there are 14 different nations around the world that have formed such groups of four as ourselves to promote the elimination of nuclear weapons in their own countries. And considering the deeply moral issues involved, religious voices began to be heard. During the Cold War, Catholic bishops and evangelicals had asked whether there could ever be a moral justification for the use of, or even the threat of use, of such deadly weapons. Most of the religious articles during the Cold War concluded that nuclear deterrence could be justified. But now, with the ending of the Cold War, it is time to re-examine that question. I leave that as a challenge for this particular university to take on that particular challenge. So we ended 2008 with more response and more unofficial support than we had truly expected. But such unofficial support can only go so far. The actions that can make a real difference on nuclear weapons must be taken by governments. And to that point, no government had spoken out. Then in 2009, a miracle occurred. Nothing less than a miracle. Just 10 weeks after he's inaugurated, President Obama made his famous speech at Prague.
The existence of thousands of nuclear weapons is the most dangerous legacy of the Cold War. Today, the Cold War has disappeared. but thousands of those weapons have not. In a strange turn of history, the threat of global nuclear war has gone down, but the risk of a nuclear attack has gone up. I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons.
A few months later, at a summit meeting in Moscow, President Obama and President Medvedev jointly declared their support of a world without nuclear weapons and made a commitment to move toward a new arms reduction treaty. Then in September, President Obama submitted a resolution to the UN Security Council supporting nuclear disarmament. Amazingly, the resolution was passed 15-0. And governments all over the world began to weigh in. The United Kingdom, Norway, Italy, and Finland each have sponsored conferences on nuclear disarmament. Japan and Australia formed an international commission on nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament, of which I was the American commissioner. So 2009 was a year of unprecedented actions that none of us could have predicted at the beginning of the year. It truly was an annus mirabilis, a year of miracles. That term has been used to describe two different miraculous years in science. In 1666, when Newton published his landmark paper on the theory of gravitation and of optics, and in 1905, when Einstein published three landmark papers, including his famous paper on the theory of relativity. In my lifetime, I can remember Václav Havel calling 1989 an annus mirabilis, as all of Eastern European nations gained their independence nearly bloodlessly, which none of us could have forecast as early, even a year or two earlier than that. And of course, that year was culminated by the fall of the Berlin Wall. I do not mean to suggest that these developments are equal in significance to those remarkable events, but considering my expectations going into 2009, I must say that I consider the developments of 2009 nothing short of miraculous. Indeed, I move to quote Victor Hugo, who more than a century earlier wrote, more powerful than the tread of mighty armies is an idea whose time has come. But if 2009 was a year of miracles, 2010 had to be a year of action. And in fact, the action exploded in one memorable week in April. On Tuesday morning of that week, President Obama released his eagerly awaited nuclear posture review. On Tuesday afternoon, he held the premiere showing of the movie The Nuclear Tipping Point in the White House Theater. His guests were the four of us who had produced the movie and our spouses, as well as his national security team. And he introduced the movie by telling his national security team that these ideas had profoundly influenced his own thinking and that he wanted them to influence the thinking of his own team. The next day, Wednesday, the president left for Prague to meet with President Medvedev. On Thursday, the two of them signed the New START Treaty. On Friday, Obama and Medvedev held a bilateral meeting. On Saturday and Sunday, 47 world leaders arrived in Washington, D.C., and on Monday and Tuesday, those leaders attended a nuclear summit held for the purpose of strengthening worldwide measures for the control of nuclear fissile material. Later that same month, the Senate held its first hearing on the New START Treaty, with the first two witnesses being Jim Schlesinger and myself. The hearing was generally friendly. Indeed, the chairman and ranking members, Senator Lugar and Senator Kerry, could hardly have been more gracious. But there was formidable opposition to the treaty in the Senate, led by Senator John Kyle. But 2010 ended with a positive note. In December, the Senate, against the expectations of many astute political observers, ratified the New START Treaty with 71 favorable votes. This was made possible by 13 Republicans going against their leadership and voting for ratification. The following month, the Russian Congress also voted for ratification. If the Senate had not ratified New START, the United States would have forfeited its right to provide world leadership, and the global nuclear disarmament effort would simply have fizzled out on the spot. So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for nuclear disarmament? The next challenge will be getting the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty ratified, which will be even more difficult than the ratification of New START, since the ratification of the CTBT has already been rejected by the Senate in 1998. If we succeed in CTBT ratification, the next challenge will be the negotiation of a follow-on treaty to New START. This is going to be even more difficult in some ways, and perhaps the greatest challenge is finally to be successful in curtailing the nuclear weapon ambitions of North Korea and Iran. All of these goals present daunting political challenges. As daunting as these near-term goals are, they are the gatekeepers to establishing really significant movement in the field of nuclear disarmament. This International Commission, of which I was the American member, designated them as phase one of a comprehensive disarmament program and called for them to be achieved by 2012. Well, lots of luck in achieving them by 2012. In the second phase, the Commission called for no less daunting actions. It called for the United States and Russia to dismantle their nuclear weapons at an aggregate rate of 1,500 per year. That includes not just the weapons deployed, but the weapons in reserve and the weapons in storage. The Commission called this new level to which they'd be brought down to as a minimization point, and then if we were able to reach that point, the world would take a deep breath, see what the geopolitical situation was at that time, and then see if it was possible to move to zero. Now, I know that most of you believe that moving towards zero nuclear weapons is, in fact, mission impossible. And I must concede that the skeptics among you have the history of the last few decades on your side. But I would like to conclude my talk by giving you the views of some prominent pragmatists who hold more hopeful views on nuclear disarmament. I'm going to start by paraphrasing President John Kennedy. Too many of us think, he said, that it is impossible to contain proliferation, but that is a dangerous and defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that nuclear terrorism or nuclear war is inevitable, that we are gripped by forces that we cannot control. Then he goes on to say, we need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, and therefore they can be solved by man. To which I would add that while the problems are man-made, we need a lot of help from women in the solution to these problems. Sam Nunn has spent most of his career working to strengthen American security and fully understands the huge task ahead in nuclear disarmament. He compares the task to that of climbing a tall mountain whose top is obscured by clouds.
The way I view it is that if you view the goal of getting to zero as the top of the mountain in terms of nuclear weapons, then we can't even see the top of the mountain today. We're heading down, we're not heading up. It's going to take a long time to see the top of the mountain, but I think we have an obligation to our children and to our grandchildren to build paths up the mountain, to get other people to go up the mountain with us, because this cannot be unilateral.
We don't quite know what the mountaintop will look like. We don't quite know how to get to that mountaintop. And we won't make any proposals that we cannot justify, but we are determined to go up that mountaintop.
If we don't give them that hope, those of us who've been through the Cold War, if we don't give them that hope and that vision, then it's going to be extremely difficult to prevent the kind of nuclear nightmare that is looming on the horizon.
George Shultz and Henry Kissinger have also thought deeply about the problems of nuclear disarmament. Here's a very brief video encapsulating their views.
A man named Max Kampelman, who had been my counselor when I was Secretary of State, made an eloquent statement emphasizing the importance of talking about what ought to be. If you're constantly mired in what is, and you never look at what ought to be, you're never going to really get anywhere. And he used the Declaration of Independence as an example. All men are created equal. In 1776, are you kidding? We had slaves. Women couldn't vote. You had to have property in order to vote. We had the ought up there. And gradually, over time, often with a lot of pain and agony and difficulty, but gradually, the is has come closer to the ought. And we ought to have a world free of nuclear weapons.
Once nuclear weapons are used, we will be driven to take global measures to prevent it. So some of us have said, let's ask ourselves, if we have to do it afterwards, why don't we do it now?
Well, I've given you the views of Kennedy, Schultz, Kissinger, and Nunn. But my benediction to you is going to be my personal views, a summary of where my journey on this less traveled road has taken me. Over the long term, we need to be heading towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And over the short term, we need to be taking the steps to reduce the danger that the nuclear weapons we already have could be used. This is such an important problem in my mind that it dwarfs all other considerations. And I have myself decided to devote the balance of my career to working to achieve that goal. So for the balance of my career, I expect to be traveling to Washington every other week, as well as making extended trips to London and Delhi and Tokyo and Seoul and Moscow and Beijing, instead of settling down to enjoy my golden years in that Garden of Eden known as Palo Alto. I do this because I believe that time is not on our side, and because, having helped to build our nuclear arsenal, I know better than most how to go about dismantling it, and because I believe I have a special responsibility to do so. Indeed, I want to express this last thought with the closing lines from Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Thank you.
Well, everybody in the house is a dove, so they're with you. I think I'll be a hawk. In the Eisenhower years, when the nuclear arsenal began to grow, John Foster Dulles and others, Admiral Radford, came together and they convinced Ike that we should have a policy of massive nuclear retaliation. Dulles, presented that view at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York in a luncheon in which Paul Nitze almost exploded. When the Democrats came to power, Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Johnson in the 60s to replace the 50s, they brought to power a young man from the Bay Area, Robert McNamara. Kennedy said he wanted a more flexible response. We got MAD, mutual assured destruction. So while these processes were at work, there was a deep understanding by some that without nuclear weapons we would have to have a larger, they thought, armed forces than we'd ever had before, given the changing nature of the dangers that might come. So for their mindset, it was that the nuclear was actually, as I say, their mindset, cheaper than holding massive numbers of people inside the Army, Navy, and Air Force and Marines. So we were always stuck with that conundrum. While we are a large nation with a large population, there are larger nations with larger populations, and no one knew how you could stand up to even the Russian military machine. So they kept the weapons even though they didn't like the weapons. So how do we get out of that problem that there are enemies and it's a dangerous world? We give up our nuclear weapons and, let us say, the new China, which is building a blue water navy, which has a very large and confident People's Liberation Army, the PLA. How would we withstand an attack on Taiwan if we'd given up these processes? Would we really be able to throw back the PLA? Your answer, please.